So I said 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 to 8. Now I'm going to tell you quite honestly, I know this was not the topic you would have picked as your number one thing. You might have, if you'd read ahead, you might not be here today. I will say that in over 45 years of teaching now, not once has any Christian ever asked me a question, what does the Bible say about lawsuits? I've been asked to speak at groups, men's groups, Christian groups, youth groups, all kinds of gatherings around the state and here in California especially, but never once has anyone said, would you do a special session or a series on lawsuits in the Bible? No one cares, by and large, and I hope you understand why it shows up here before we're done. There is a reason Paul goes here. It seems odd, doesn't it? Paul is addressing a church, and he's saying that this church has some serious problems. And you have to admit, Corinth is a mess, right? Just about anything that can go wrong has gone wrong here, and he even starts with this. He's saying you have issues, and you understand why I picked the first issue to really come home with. 4 chapters, he builds this problem. You're thinking like the world, and here's what it results in. And the first sin he confronted was?
Division.
Really the biggie. A division was there, absolutely. That was the starting point. He said these divisions, because of your thinking, led to this. Incest.
Yes.
I mean, if you're going to make a case that says, oh, here's your division, you're divided over what should be true, you're divided over this, here's how your thinking is so twisted. Here we have a church where they have an incestuous relationship, and the church is saying,
Go for it.
great, look how forward think. We are a progressive group of people, there's not a problem. So you can see why Paul starts there. He's going to make a point to say, your thinking is this twisted, you're divided over things you shouldn't be divided over. Here's the perfect example. It's a little hard to argue with this beginning point, isn't it? But now he's going to go with something else. Let me read these 8 verses for you. And hopefully, before we're done, you understand why it's in here. But it says, if any of you has a dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you're to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the things of this life? Therefore, if you have disputes about such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. I say this to your shame. Is it possible that there is nobody among you who is wise enough to judge a dispute between believers? But instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. The very act that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Instead, you yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. Here Paul is going after a problem of lawsuits. Lawsuits in the church, petty bickering, and things that are coming up. Again, coming out of this issue of a wrong kind of thinking. I want to start by telling you this. Let me tell you some things very carefully so that we don't get off on the wrong foot on this. I've heard this taught by some Christians that will tell you this. A Christian never has the right to use a law court for anything. That is their absolute, there it is right here, you never use a law court for anything. And if you just took this passage in isolation, I think they might be even able to make a case on that, except for a few problems. I will note this. Do you note that Paul used the legal system more than once to effect? He wasn't shy about it. He was quite willing to lean on his status as a Roman citizen and claim those rights under the law when necessary, most especially to defend his ability to share the gospel. I want you to start. Here's the key element in understanding this. What Paul is beginning with is this. When we have disputes, when we have issues within the family of God, it is incumbent upon us to take those issues before God and before the church and apply God's word to resolve them rather than going immediately to the courts. This does not mean that you can always avoid the court. I will be very honest about this. There are things that the civil courts have to decide that we do not have the power to decide here. And there's also, unfortunately, this reality. In some cases, despite your willingness and your desire to follow God's direction, there are believers who will not yield to God's word. I put this out, and I've dealt with this on more than one occasion, even in the case of my own son, where you have a spouse that claims to be a Christian and says, I'm leaving the relationship. You do not want this. You are begging them not to, and that person is saying, I'm going. You may wind up in court whether you want to be there or not. Issues of child custody, issues of finances, and some things may happen. This guideline here, this demand, is where we should be. And I wish it was where we always are in settling things, but it will not always be the case. So with that understanding, I want to put this before you and I should make you understand what's going on here. What Paul is addressing. Now, this will come as a surprise to you. In our legal system, of course, these silly things never happen. What was occurring in their legal system is petty and silly things were going to court. Things that never should have been allowed in court, things that are just absolutely ludicrous for people to sue over, was happening. I know you've never heard of anything like that, right? Do you know there are websites you can go to right now that are dedicated to finding the dumbest lawsuits available.
Wow.
Lists of them. You can go and look up dumb lawsuits or ridiculous or frivolous suits or just the most ridiculous law, and there'll go a series of sites where they track these things that go on. Have you heard of some things that have hit you as just some of the dumbest things that have wound up in court where you go, why didn't the judge go, I'm fining you $1,000 for stupidity, take this out of my courtroom? You wondering why some of these things? There's the classic. You've all heard this one, right? Remember the lady who sued McDonald's over what? Remember this one? Hot coffee. She bought a cup of, I want you to remember, this is the definition of the drink she purchased. Hot coffee. Now, what do you know immediately about this drink that you just purchased?
It's hot.
It's hot. She put it between her thighs in a car and drove off. And then was shocked to find that if you drove this car and had something bad happen, you could spill hot coffee, and you know what hot coffee does? It burns. She won. They had to pay that off. I've seen several of these. One of my favorites is a classic. This came out of San Francisco. A man fell while entering a store and severely injured himself and sued for millions of dollars. Now, he was entering the store by cutting a hole through the roof so that he could rob the store. And that one went to trial. My favorite right now, however, is a current thing. A man is suing the Spalding Company because his basketball went flat. Yes, you see, Spalding has a basketball, an NBA official basketball, that says that our valve is designed to keep that ball inflated for a full year, and his didn't. Spalding said, we had a defective basketball, we'll send you a new one. But he is suing for, anybody want to tell you the number?
$10 million.
$5 million for a flat basketball.
Honey, I got a lot of flat
Wow.
basketballs.
Yeah, you should take it in.
Attach that suit.
Wow.
I'm letting this out here because litigiousness, this tendency to sue because you think you might get money for something stupid, is a common human issue. And what Paul is addressing here is something we should certainly relate to, because stupid things are not only being argued about, but they're being taken by believers against believers before the court. Now here's Paul's biggest complaint in this whole thing. Remember here, if you look back again at verse 8 in this whole thing, instead yourselves cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. And he says you're doing this to your brothers, to people you're supposed to care about, and you're doing it in front of unbelievers. Here's the thing, it's bad that you're stupid. It's worse that you're stupid enough to sue over it, and what's really worse is that you're stupid enough to do this in front of the unbelievers to undo everything you claim to stand for as a believer. The character, the issues of forgiveness, the issues of loving one another, all the things you claim are your life standard, you're willing to just throw away because of a stupid lawsuit in front of other people.
Isn't it amazing, though, that they're so accepting and loving and caring that they'll turn an eye away from incest, but then they'll sue over all the little stupid things, and they're so accepting, but until you torque me off, and then we're going to tort law or whatever.
Yeah, we get upset and we immediately have to sue because we know our pound of flesh. But what's worse here in Paul's point is this. You know it's dishonest. You know there's really no grounds for this, and you're doing it because you think you might get away with it.
Oh,
I
and,
can't-
and the classic, right? Oh, but I'm gonna give some of this, my winnings to charity.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, I'm gonna
Maybe
give
the side
10%.
Yeah.
I'll do my tithe. Get that I get that $5 million from Spalding, and I will do this. There we go. But you're doing this, you're parading this in front of the world. Now, certainly, I think there's a common sense element of this, that we understand that some things really shouldn't be done in front of everyone else. You must have had this conversation sometime. Honey, can we wait until we get home before we do? Do we have to do this here? Yeah, or can we, kids, go upstairs. Let's get this settled before we have the kid. There's an understanding that sometimes some things shouldn't be shared with everybody. And then, of course, I've had those situations, the most awkward situations I can remember in my years of living, where there's the guy or the lady in the situation, the couple is having an issue going on, and one is saying, can we wait to do this? And the other one's going, no, we're going to settle this right now. You don't mind, do you? And I'm going, look at the time. I didn't realize it was so late. We need to be going, and they're going to have, he wants to throw down right now. Some people just have this desire, this push to put it out in the public. And certainly, you can see again, because we turn it into entertainment.
Yeah.
As a little kid, I remember they had this big dramatic show, Divorce Court.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm thinking, you're gonna go on TV, real couples with real problems, really?
They still have people's court or something.
We have
like that.
People's Court, Judge Judy, we have all the, yes, we are entertained by people saying stupid things in front of a courtroom. And I say that because I want you to hold on to that idea of what's going on here. This issue of going into the public forum, having these disagreements. All of this, there's a reason Paul addresses this here, and it goes right back to those first 4 chapters where Paul has spent all of 1 Corinthians, the early part, saying, you've got a thinking problem. You have thought like the world, and you've brought that in. Remember this whole thing? You need to get rid of the leaven. A little leaven levels the whole lump. And he's saying, there it is. There's another sign of this little bit of the old world that you wouldn't get rid of, and you've drug it into the church, and look what it's doing to you. Look what it's doing to you. Now, let you understand this. Here is the court system that would have been common in Corinth. And here's what Paul is trying to address. And I think you'll start to see why it is that people insist on having this in the public forum rather than settling it. The court system in ancient Greece became the basis of the court system that rolled into the Roman Empire and largely started by Athens. The Athenian system Athens was very proud of its democracy. And they decided that democracy needed to function everywhere, and they pushed this as a very big deal. And one of their things was, if you're going to have democracy, everybody needs to participate. If you're going to have democracy, you need to participate in democracy. You have responsibilities as a citizen. And they had all these things where people had to serve for a certain time, at certain ages in their life, and do this. But here was the beginning system. Ray, you have an issue with John here. And it's over a garage door that you felt like he does not happy with the work. You're looking to say, it's exactly what I told him I was going to do. That's the door he ordered. Here's his signature. He's saying, no, that's not what I said. And you guys are going back and forth, and there needs to be a settlement. Stage 1 in Athens would be this. We're going to take you 2 guys, we're going to sit you in a room, and we're going to get an arbiter. Tom, I know you're not feeling well, but we need an arbiter. We need somebody that's had some background, has some calmness. You look like God doesn't get too riled too easily. You need to sit down, listen to the 2 sides, and try to offer advice to get these 2 guys to reconcile. That was phase 1. You guys don't reconcile. You're still not happy with the garage door. You still want to get paid. Things are not good. Stage 2. Stage 2 went to the court of what they called 40. The 40 meant that the city tried to have at least 40 or more men who at age 60 were then compelled into service in the city. For the year from age 60 to 61, if you were healthy and sharp enough of mind to do so, you served as an arbiter in this court. Now, you guys make your case, and the court sits back, and you would draw from the 40 at least 3 men, often more, that would then sit down and give a ruling based on what they heard. And the idea being a guy at age 60 is bound to have lived a little bit of life and understood some things and could have some wisdom to make a decision. And now we have a decision. And you know what they say? Pay the guy for the garage door. He did exactly what he said he's going to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm 67. I couldn't be on the court, but if I was, I'd make you pay for the garage. Anyway,
Didn't say when.
didn't say what. Here's the next step. You can appeal that. And here's where things get off the rails in the Athenian legal system. You can appeal to the court, to the public court of Athens. And the public court was comprised of any male citizen aged 30 and above who could cast a vote. And here's the thing, in the public court system, all you need to do is get a majority to agree with you. It is not contingent upon preponderance of evidence. It is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It is the two of you make your case to this large audience, and that audience can be anywhere from 201 men to multiple thousands, because you could demand a hearing before the city, and every adult male aged 30 and above would have to come and listen to two of you lay out your cases, and then they would vote, and if you got the most votes, you ain't paying for the garage door. Now, I want you to think about this for
We
a
don't
second.
hate you though.
You don't necessarily have a lawyer. It is all based on your oratory ability to move a mass of people to emotionally attach themselves to you and like your case better than the other guys. Now, I want you to think about if you're the kind of person who wants to win and can get a big cash settlement, and you're good with words. You're a person who can get a crowd stirred up. Have you seen some of the people that stir up these crowds, these protests and different things, the speakers that can do that? If you can get the mob to get really excited about this, you can win, whether your case makes any sense or not. All you have to do is talk better than Ray, and you might get the majority of the citizens to go your way. Now, if that's the legal system, and you've got a case where you think you can make some money, are you going to listen to the arbiters? Are you going to listen to the court of 40 and let the judge decide? Or are you going to go straight to home and try to nail it in front of the crowd? You're going to go to the crowd, aren't you? It was once said that every Athenian was a lawyer. The historian made that comment because they all knew that. And here's the other thing. Remember the setting we told you about? They loved to listen to the philosophers debate. That was their entertainment. There was nothing more entertaining than watching two guys slug it out and argue about how the other one was bad and I'm the good guy. And the city loved these moments of arguing back and forth. They adored it. And so they would dip into that and they would go for it. And the church, here's the problem. There's the moral issue Paul is looking at. You're not the least bit concerned with what's right. You're not even concerned with what's just. You're concerned with what you can get out of this. And you recognize that if you took it to the church and people sat down and looked at what does God really say, what is fair, what is reasonable, what is right, you might not win. Yes.
On the one hand, it's like, how could they do that and be believers? But it sounds like it was such ingrained in their culture that this is just what you do.
This is what you do.
And so they don't realize that's wrong. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Paul's if they would stop to think about it for a moment, they'd realize it's wrong, but they're so ingrained in the world's thinking that it never dawns on them. This is what we do. I want you to understand, the system that Athens tried to do was, like I said, the whole idea was we are democracy and people are going to decide everything. And the law, there's a reason that when our forefathers made a legal system, they read how the Athenians did this and made a radical change. Just because of the abuses. Here was the law that they had at Athens. One of the things you could take to court. Here you go. You think Daryl over here is planning to take over the city and be a dictator. You just know it. I can smell it on him. You could make that charge in Athens.
Pinky in the brain.
There you go. You could make that charge in Athens.
I've seen him take over baseball diamonds.
I have! You know, now that you mention it, and you better use that example when we have the court. You could, just because and here's what the thing, they wanted to defend the democracy from having a dictator. And so if you felt someone was trying to take over, you make the charge, the entire city would come out, males over 30, and if you can get a big enough vote because you think that's what Daryl's trying to do, he could be banished from the city for life.
Go to Oklahoma.
They thought they were, but you're exactly right, they thought they were protecting themselves from a dictator. But let's say you want to be the dictator, and you know people really like Daryl. Who do you want to get out of the way? And here's the plot. Anything you want, and all you have to do is get the majority of the mob upset enough to throw him out for life.
Based on nothing, right?
Doesn't have to be based on anything but your sense of it. Remember again, it wasn't required that you showed beyond a reasonable doubt. It wasn't even required that a preponderance of the evidence. It was required that you convince enough of the people that's what's going on in his head. And this happened. Athens had a situation, following the Battle of Marathon, Persia had invaded, and Athens had a situation where there were 3 men who were very influential in the city. And one of them didn't want it to be any more than one man influential in the city. And so he brought charges and actually got both of the other men banished for life because they were worried about those 2 men becoming dictators. And guess who ran the city?
Yeah, new dictator.
We had the new dictator. That didn't last in this case, and the reason being he got rid of the two best generals that Athens had, and the Persians invaded again, and he had to go have the law overturned because he wasn't a general, he was a politician, and he realized he couldn't keep the city without the help of those 2 guys. And so he had to drag them back home. That was the first time Athens ever overturned that law. They decided that's probably being taken over the Persians isn't worth keeping the banishment.
Yeah.
And so they brought the 2 men back. We also found this, that you could sway the crowd with the right kind of gifts and so forth. One man after the Battle of Marathon was suspected of taking a bribe from the Persians because he tried to throw the battle, as it turned out. He tried to hold his group back long enough for them to lose the fight. He was charged with that and found guilty and was going to be banished. But then he said, tell you what, as a settlement, I will donate, and he offered the biggest chunk of silver anyone had ever seen, which pretty much proved he had been bribed by the Persians because it was Persian silver. But guess what happened when he offered this biggest amount of bribe anyone had ever seen? He was found and acquitted. I say this because that's why we made a change. You might remember that our thing came down to this, that we had 2 branches of government that were voted for and one that wasn't. Because the founders said, you know what? Having a legal system that is based on public opinion and how the mob feels is a bad idea. You want a group that is not answerable to a voting public whose whims change and go with the tides. You need someone who have to judge based on what is written in the law, constitutional law. It was different in those times. Here's another thing that's kind of interesting at the time. The Romans had adopted much of this same kind of procedure and action. They did have a little better legal system, but as I told you, the Roman system was horribly corrupt. Bribes were very common. Political influence was used in the courts all the time. But the Romans allowed for something. They allowed for some groups to govern and make decisions outside of Roman courts. You know who the first group that did this more often than anybody else was? Jews. The Jews, they said, you know what, we'll let you. If you might remember this, Pilate turned to the Jewish accusers and said, you try him. You make the decision. And they said no. Remember why they didn't want to make the decision? The one limitation was you could not have capital punishment. That had to be approved by a Roman court. There were limitations. But here's the thing, quite honestly, other than that trial, which was a fiasco beyond belief, Jewish law was better than Roman law. You have any idea why?
Based on the Bible.
It was based on the Bible, which made certain demands. You had to try this. To try someone, you had to have witnesses. Someone to verify the charge. You had to prove your case. And Jewish law, the Romans found out, were rather impressed with it. 1, it kept their stuff out of the Roman courts. And 2, they found out that justice actually got meted out better than their own courts, and so they let them do it. Another group followed, they gave the same privilege to. the church. You have any idea why? They thought they were a Jewish sect. Early on, the Romans said this, the Jews arguing over Jewish stuff. So they gave them this. So Paul understands that they even had the right to do this. That the courts were going to allow them the ability to deal with these sorts of things. So he's confronting them and saying, why don't you deal with this? Why don't you take advantage of this and act? Now I want to go through this passage and I want you to see some things. That their whole misunderstanding came from misunderstanding the place of the church, the role of the believer, and also a complete misunderstanding of the responsibility they had before a lost world. Now look how he starts. If any of you has a dispute with another, anybody have a different translation than that?
Case.
Grievance? Grievance.
Have a grievance and so forth with another. Any different word there? Neighbor. Okay, it is another. The Greek there, another of the same kind. I want you to understand this. It isn't just someone who lives nearby. The Greek is talking about a dispute with another. And if you're a believer, what would the same kind be? Another believer. You have this with another believer, and you take him before the ungodly for judgment instead of before the saints. This is the problem he has. You've got an issue here. You've lacked an understanding. Why would you go there? He's saying because there's a basis here. What is the beginning point that's going to be different if the church judges it as opposed to the world? What's the biggest distinction in the thinking of the people you're going to go before? Why is Paul saying it's really critical for Christians to deal with Christian issues before Christians? What is your thinking? How is your thinking different than how the world would address the problem?
Supposedly not selfish.
Not selfish? What?
The worldview.
You don't have the world's view of things.
This is your basis.
Your basic worldview. And okay, give me some examples of how the worldview differs in a Christian from a non-Christian.
Don't lie.
What is right?
Hey, don't lie. We might want to just tell the truth and not embellish things because it helps our case.
What is right and wrong?
What is right and wrong? There's a question we might want to ask. What is really right in this situation? What? Yes.
As believers, our goal should be to glorify God, so reconciliation around not money or let's see how that happens, but what's gonna glorify God?
What's going to glorify God? And reconciliation, now you're getting to another point. What is the foundation of our faith?
Reconciliation between God
Forgiveness and reconciliation, which means even if you're right, you may be willing to forego certain things for what is better, what is going to be more glorifying to God, and for the fact that the individual, even if they owe you the money, might not have the means, and perhaps forgiveness is the kinder thing to do. These attitudes change that. Yeah, well,
The judges know they're accountable to God.
there's the other. I'm not just serving for a pay. I'm serving this thing, and I'm accountable to God for the decision I make. It really matters that I do this right. It changes all that. But an attitude of forgiveness, a willingness to say that the relationship might be more important than the legal issue. There are things here going on that we don't think about. Now, here's always the first starting point. You're going to have a lawsuit. And you sit down with a lawyer. You know what one of the first questions always is in that situation when you think you're going to sue somebody for something? How much do you think we can get? How much do you think we can get? What is the question that should be asked in a Christian setting? What's fair? What is right? What is the best outcome for this? That is a very different beginning point. That is a very different beginning point that they have. Here's the other one that comes in. You may have heard this term. It's often used in divorce settings. They had irreconcilable differences. Irreconcilable differences. I want you to understand that. That has no place in a Christian setting. There is no such thing. And I know we always have excuses. Well, I'd like to forgive, but it didn't seem sincere to me. It wasn't strong enough. I needed a more concise apology. Here's the other one that comes in. If he would have done this 2 months ago, but it's a little late now. Really? You know what? I remember a guy on a cross that seemed, boy, you put this off a while before you came to terms with God. but you're going to say you're sorry now? And God goes, a little late. No. He didn't do that.
Convenient now.
Yeah, it seems a little convenient now. There's always some reason that we're justified in not reconciling and not forgiving. There's always something they should have done better that justifies us to say, I'm not the least bit interested in making this thing right. I'm just not. And Paul's going, there's a difference here that we have to look to Christians to deal with this. Notice what he says here. To dispute with another, dare he take it before the ungodly. Yours might say the unjust. I think ungodly is the better understanding here. He's not implying that every non-Christian judge is corrupt and untrustworthy. It's not what he's saying. He's not saying you can't get a fair judgment in a non-Christian court. But he is saying ungodly means a different mindset. An entirely different mindset than what we would have in approaching this. There are bigger principles at stake. The gospel of forgiveness and reconciliation and restoration talks about a different outcome because it's with a brother. This is family. I think we all have to admit this. You put up with some things with family you wouldn't take from anybody else. Because they're what? It's blood. In this case, it's a whole different thing, and it's a much deeper bond. But there's a different driving factor to what we do here. Not just an unjust thing. And I said, Paul used the Roman courts. He dealt with these kind of things. He's not saying it's never a place to have that. But he is saying this, it needs to be settled. And here's his case. Because here's what somebody's going to say. I need a legal expert. I can't trust you people. What do you know about the law? What do you know? And here's Paul's point. Here it goes, this whole thing. Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if you are to judge the world, are you not competent to judge trivial cases? He's saying this, I have changed you in a way of thinking that gives you insight and the capacity where I'm going to make you kings and judges and rulers over a new creation. If that's my plan for you, do you really think you can't deal with this thing about a garage door? You think I can't? You think the saints can't, from the wisdom of God, from God's word, you think God has not provided enough insight to deal with stupid stuff like this? Is that really the argument you want to make? That's really where you're going to go with this? And he expands it. Do you not know that we will judge angels? Here he goes. Try this one. One of these days, you are going to sit in rulership over the highest created being God made. Now, the question always comes up to this. What does he mean you're going to rule over angels? What does he mean you're going to judge? I'll give you a distinct answer. I have no idea. Because it's in the Anarthros, we don't even know which angels he's talking about here. It doesn't have the definite article and say which particular angels, and it's not expanded on anyplace else. Now, there's been a debate going on. What means you're going to judge fallen angels? Well, maybe. I guess you can make the case for that. But the problem with the word judge also can be translated as rule. It's the exact same word. So maybe it just means you're going to rule over, be in charge of good angels. Which one? Again, no idea. If nobody tells you they know, they don't. Paul isn't trying to give you a theological insight here so much as he's trying to give you a principle that says if God sees you as fit to rule in high-level situations, the idea being, if I'm going to put you on the Supreme Court, I think you can handle the Palmdale bench. You can do the lower court. And then he expands that even. How much more the things of this life. Therefore, if you have disputes among such matters, appoint as judges even men of little account in the church. Now here's what he's saying. Because again, the argument is, I look at the church, there's just nobody sharp enough to handle this. And Paul goes, you know what? The dumbest guy you've got, as long as he's living life on God's principles, is better suited to handle these kind of things and make a godly decision than the sharpest legal mind in the outside world. I'll take the worst Christian on godly principles in terms of his sharpness, in terms of his intelligence, over the sharpest non-Christian. Now that seems extreme, doesn't it? But that's what he's saying. I'll take the lesser one. You want to complain you don't have anybody? Even men of little account in the church. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between two believers? Here he's going this. He goes, I anticipate your argument. I know that you're going to say that you just don't have to be sharp enough. But I'm telling you, the least available, the worst guy you've got is still better than what you do in the outside. But here's the thing. I know that's not true. I know there's a number of you there who know Scripture and who are very sharp. I know for a fact you have some very wise people in your midst. And matter of fact, there's a little bit of a shot here. Because you remember how they regarded themselves? We are wise. We are kings. He's going, if you're so stinking smart, and now you're trying to make the case that nobody there is smart enough to handle this, I see a little disconnect. We're the best there is, but we don't have anybody able. What? That doesn't make any sense. That's what he's trying to go after here. There are people wise enough. But he said, but instead, one brother goes to law against another, and this in front of unbelievers. You are undoing the entirety of the gospel for the sake of a financial gain, for the opportunity to win. I have to win this. I have to come out ahead. And I am quite willing to parade this and damage the church's testimony for my ego. Is that where you really want to go? Is that how you really want to handle this? The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means you have been completely defeated already. Because you're not resolving anything. You lost the fight the second you let it get to the point that you have to sue somebody. When you lost control to the point that you and I can't settle this, we've got to go to court. We lost already. We've already ruined the fellowship. We've already done such a level of damage that we're not resolving anything anymore. The second it has to go to court, the issue is lost already. Why not rather be wronged? Oh, wow. Now, it's one thing to say, why go to the courts, let's get it settled. You may not get the money you thought, but he says, this what? You know what's even more important than that? Your testimony is so important that, quite frankly, it'd be better if you lost the case, even if you're right, than to take this to the unbelieving court and damage Christ's testimony. I'd rather you lost. I'd rather you be taken advantage of than to do this. Look like you're that thoughtful moment. I don't want to shut down your Roger's insight. That's it. No, they have this. He goes, this is how bad it is. Rather be wronged. It is interesting. There was a Greek that got a very Christian concept on this, a Greek philosopher looking at the legal system in Athens that made this comment. He says, a really good man will be willing to be wronged rather than to do wrong. A really good man will be willing to be wronged rather than to do wrong.
Ooh, let's follow him.
That's Plato. And Plato was quite right about this one. And we have that principle right here, that it's better to be wronged than to do wrong. That winning the case is not nearly as important as having the character you're supposed to have as a believer. Instead, you yourself cheat and do wrong, and you do this to your brothers. There's a problem there. There's an issue there that sort of throws things out. There is a principle that is supposed to govern us that is deeper than our rights, deeper than our pride, and critical to our right conduct before God. And that is this principle of forgiveness. Now, you might recall this story from Matthew 18. Jesus brings this whole idea home in Matthew 18, just toward the end of the section that deals with the church and discipline. I believe in verse 21, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, yes. You just done this thing. Jesus has just taught this whole thing on restoration, on church discipline, on taking action, and he's made it plain that the whole point is to restore a brother. And now he's going to drive the point home. And Peter takes a real beating. I think it's unfair for poor Peter. Peter is going to make a comment here. Look at this. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7? And people go, there's old idiot Peter not getting it. I want you to understand, Peter was sharper than the rest of the apostles. He caught on to the message that forgiveness is what we're supposed to be about, and it's supposed to be at a higher level than how the world deals with that. And so he says, okay, I want to make sure I understand it. And Peter gets it, that we're raising the bar here on forgiveness. And he goes, you know what? What about this? And understand the setting. What if my brother does the same exact stupid thing, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 7? He goes, Lord, and in his mind, I get it. We're going to forgive. We're going the extra mile, but he has to ask this question. At some point, you got to say, if he keeps doing the same thing and asking forgiveness, how serious is he? And so Peter raises the bar and goes 7 times. I mean, at what point do you have to say, this guy is just not redeemable? And he thinks, I put a pretty high number on there. What was Jesus' response? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times. Let's go 490, shall we? Now, that's a pretty high bar.
1 every 3 minutes. If you stayed on awake all day.
There you go. It's just crazy. Therefore, he goes, sorry. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, here's the example he's going to give. 10,000 talents. I want you to understand, a talent represented 1,000 weeks of the average salary. 1,000 weeks of an average salary. And this servant, now try this. How does a servant run up a debt of 10,000 talents? I want you to understand that basically means he owed what a man would make in more than 192 years of working. 192 years. Worse yet, he's confronted with it and he says, I have no means to pay. Crazy. How do you steal that much? Worse yet, how did you spend it all already? How did you pull that one off?
Maybe was he taking the guy's money and investing it, trying to earn more money from him or something, and had to pay for his faults? Maybe.
We don't know, but a servant somehow, now basically, if this is the king and he's been ripping off the king, he must have stolen nearly the value of the kingdom here. And he doesn't have a dime to show for it. Remember that? And since you are not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all he had sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him, and be patient with me, I will pay back everything. No, you won't. It's not even remotely possible. Now, what's the point of the story? Who's the king here? God. Who's the one who owes? And it's an unpayable debt. Unpayable, right? And what does the king do with the unpayable debt? He forgives it. Now you remember the rest of the story? What happens next?
He goes to his meeting.
The servant had a servant. And the servant owed 100 days of wages. And what happened when he said he couldn't pay? Wringing his neck. And the guy goes, I'll pay you back everything. And quite frankly, he probably could, given time. It was reasonable for him to pay back, but he wouldn't do it. What's the message there and how we're supposed to treat other believers then? If we're both servants and we both owe, and my debt was paid, and now there's a debt paid to me, what is my attitude toward it? All of this to come up and say that what Paul is going after here is an attitude of thinking in the church of how valuable is this fellowship to us. How much does that other person in the church matter to you? Do you care enough to forego justice to do kindness? Will you forego a debt in order to give a right kind of testimony? And that's the primary point of this passage. We are always willing to go where we think we can get a gain. Are we willing to go where we can make a statement for Jesus Christ that impacts the world? There's one more story I would put out to you. There's a story that talks about this. It said a man was found against him in a law court, and he lost his cloak. Remember what the command that Jesus gave him was? You need to pay off. And they take his cloak, and he doesn't say, he can't go, that's just my cloak. How am I going to live? I mean, the cloak was the most basic element of his wardrobe. The command was, you pay with the next garment that you have. Now, that seems ridiculous, but here's the principle to that one. Here's the worst part. You guys have had that. We're back to the garage door again. And in the course of discussion and fighting, it turns out that, you know what? I really didn't perform like I thought I was supposed to. I can win this case, but I didn't really perform the way I was supposed to. Not only should you do what is just, but having been found wrong, you should go beyond that. And now I'm going to
You're getting
settle.
steel back insulated with windows.
You go the extra mile that says, now that I recognize that I was wrong in this case, I'm not gonna do just what is fair. I'm gonna go beyond to make you understand that I see that, and this is, I'm begging for forgiveness. I am laying out to you, and I'm sorry, on top of doing what's just. And a believer, when they find they're wrong, needs to go more than just, you know what, okay, I was wrong. You ever been wrong? How far do you want to go? Okay, I gave you the apology. Can we be done? You know, I said I was sorry. Now drop it. The thing is to go further with a broken heart that says, I shouldn't have started this thing. And there's the attitudes we're supposed to carry. And this is what Paul is trying to get at. When you think like the world, you're going to act like the world. And let's go to this. In all honesty, here's the next thing I want to just tell. I'll end with this question. Have you noticed that the world hasn't been making the best decisions when it comes to sorting things out? Have you noticed the world really isn't all that competent in getting it right? So why are we in a rush to go to them to get things settled?
Yeah, right.
Why do we think they have the wisdom to make this right? They can't even get their own house in order. Why do we think they have a place to settle the issues between the people of God? Questions or comments? We'll close this out. Ryan, anything you want to put into this? I hope you see why we dealt with lawsuits here. It has to do with thinking.